The early 80s were a turning point, not just some time we lived in. It spun us off into the future. Let this old geezer take you back to when the future began. Thanks for dropping by. I'm CJ, this is Geezer Gab, and today we're talking about one of the most compressed, most electric periods of change that I've lived through. The 5 years between 1980 and 1985. Now, I want to be upfront. This is a big topic, and I'm not going to be doing any hard investigative reporting here. Think of this as a kitchen table conversation between you and me. It's not a thesis. I lived through this. I remember how it felt, and that's really what I want to talk about. Not the history book version, but the version where you're standing in a gas line wondering, what the hell happened? If that sounds familiar, stick around. And if you're younger and you're wondering what the big deal was, I think you'll find some context here that explains a lot about the world you inherited. To understand 1980, you have to understand the 70s. And friends, the 70s were a lot. If you'd like to skip over the 70s, go to this timestamp to just get on with the 80s. So, early 70s. Vietnam had ground on for years, and even after it ended, the hangover was real. In the culture, in the politics, in the way that people trusted or didn't trust their own government. This wasn't helped by the politics of the Nixon administration, which was punctuated when he resigned before he could be impeached. His successor, President Ford, pardoned him, which went over just about as well as you'd expect. And then Ford launched something called WIN, Whip Inflation Now, which was essentially a PR campaign with a button. A button. That was the plan. Inflation was brutal. Mortgage rates, and I want you to really hear this. Mortgage rates climbed into the high teens. The high teens. If you wanted to buy a house in the late 70s or early 80s, you were looking at 18% interest. Today, when 7% interest is dream-crushing for many, that sounds like science fiction. Back then, it was just Tuesday. And then there were the oil crises, 2 of them. For the second one in 1979, I got to enjoy taking my dad's car to the gas station while he drove the other one to work. So I got to get it filled with as much gas as they'd allow. There was odd-even rationing, meaning you could only buy gas on certain days depending on your license plate number. You'd easily sit in line for an hour or more for gas, sometimes just for a few gallons. President Carter gave what became known as his malaise speech. And while he never actually used the word malaise, the feeling was there. The sense that maybe America had hit some kind of ceiling. And then the Iran hostage crisis began. 444 days. That number is burned into my brain. ABC launched a late-night news program just to cover it, every night. You might know it today as Nightline. It started as a hostage crisis update. That's how consuming that event was. By 1980, a lot of Americans were just tired. Not angry exactly, tired, and a little disillusioned. And then February 1980 happened. A bunch of college-aged kids beat the Soviet Union in hockey at the Lake Placid Olympics.
You believe in miracles? Yes!
I don't know if younger viewers can fully grasp what that meant. Emotionally, in the aftermath of Vietnam, it was communism versus democracy, with sticks and a puck. The Soviets were the best hockey team on the planet. They were a hockey-winning machine with professionals. And we sent a team of amateurs. Kids, really. And they won. That wasn't just a sports moment. That was a permission slip. Permission to feel good again about the country and about yourself. It was permission to think that maybe, just maybe, things could turn around. And then came Reagan. Now, I'm going to say one thing about Reagan, and then we're going to move on, because the full Reagan conversation is its own video, at least. What I will say is this: whatever you think of his policies, and there's plenty to think about, the man gave a worn-out country exactly what it was craving: optimism. Folksy, unhurried, quippy optimism. He made people feel like the confident adults were back in charge. Whether that was entirely true is a conversation for another day, but the psychological salve he provided to a weary population, that part is real. And it's underappreciated in most of the histories written about him, pro or con. January 20th, 1981, Reagan's inauguration day, Iran released the hostages. They'd held them for 444 days and waited until Carter was literally out of office to let them go. Make of that what you will. What I remember most from those days isn't the politics. It's Neil Diamond's America playing everywhere. On the radio, at events, in stores. They're coming to America. It became a kind of unofficial anthem for that moment. This feeling that we were still something worth coming to, worth believing in, and more importantly, that we could bring our own back home. Through 81 and 82, things were still rough economically. Interest rates were still punishing, but there was a different feeling in the air, like the worst might be behind us. And slowly, it actually started to feel that way. By the mid-'80s, interest rates had come down significantly from their peak. Not overnight, not painlessly, but the direction had changed. And when you've been white-knuckling it through 17% mortgages, even 10% feels like a gift. And that's why a lot of us geezers don't flinch when there's a little inflation happening. Been there, done that. Optimism started to outpace pessimism. Not universally, there were still real problems and real struggles, but the national mood had shifted. It felt like we'd turned a corner, with reservations, sure, but we had turned it. Then came the 1984 Los Angeles Olympics. The Soviets boycotted, payback for Carter's 1980 boycott of Moscow's games, more or less. And you know what? We Olympicked the heck out of Los Angeles. The games turned a profit, which almost never happens, and the whole thing felt like a victory lap for a country that had been on its heels for a decade. We weren't just hosting the Olympics, we were winning the Olympics in our own backyard. Meanwhile, something else was happening. Quietly at first, then all at once. August 1st, 1981. MTV launched, and music was never the same. Now, there had been music videos before, but they were novelties, promotions, etc. MTV made them the thing. Suddenly, rock music wasn't just something you heard, it was something you watched 24 hours a day. Artists who had been making records for years suddenly had to think about how they looked or how they presented themselves. New artists built their entire identity around the visual. Madonna, Michael Jackson with Thriller, David Bowie reinventing himself yet again. The music didn't just grow up, it bloomed. It was like the creative energy of the 60s had matured and found a whole new canvas. And then there were the computers. In 1981, IBM released its personal computer, the IBM PC. And this was different from what had come before. This wasn't targeted as a hobbyist toy. This was a business machine, or at least the machine businesses were willing to buy. And when Lotus 123 came out in 1983, a spreadsheet program that could do in seconds what accountants had spent days doing by hand, the business world sat up and paid attention. Hard. Then January 1984, the Super Bowl. Apple ran a commercial. You've probably seen it, even though they only ran it once. A woman athlete running through a gray Orwellian world and smashing a screen symbolizing Apple destroying IBM's control. And 2 days later, the Macintosh went on sale. Now, compared to today, the IBM PC and the Mac were toys. But back then, they were our first steps toward the mythical flying cars. The Mac wasn't just a computer. It was a paradigm shift. You didn't type commands at it. You pointed and clicked with this funny little thing called a mouse. The Mac had a little trash can. It had fonts that looked like actual fonts. And for the first time, a computer felt like it was designed for people, not programmers. We haven't looked back since. Here's the thing I'm most wistful about when I look back at that era. The kids growing up in the early 80s, not me, I was a working adult, were probably the last generation to have what I'd call digital innocence. The highest technology most people encountered day to day was an answering machine and maybe a VCR. If your family had a computer, it may have had a modem. You know, that glorious, almost comforting sound. Not that there was a lot to connect to yet. That would have to wait until the 90s. And connections were slow. God, they were slow. 300 bits per second. Eventually 1200 bits per second. We called it baud back then. My current connection tops out at 1200 million bits per second. 1,000,000 times faster, literally. While I have nostalgia for the sound, I have no warm feelings about how slow it was. But I digress. The kids of the early 80s played outside. They got bored. They had to find things to do. The world wasn't in their pocket. It wasn't even in their house, really. And there's something about that vestige of childhood freedom and adventure that feels significant now in a way it didn't then. So, 1980 to 1985. We went from gas lines and a hostage crisis and a national mood that felt like a smoldering dumpster to MTV and Macintoshes and a country that had rediscovered its swagger. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't simple, and some of the seeds planted in those years grew into things we're still sorting out today, good and bad. But if you lived through it, if you remember where you were when the miracle on ice happened, or the first time you heard a modem connect, or the first time you saw Michael Jackson moonwalk on your TV, you know what I mean when I say it felt like something. It felt like the future was actually going to show up. To the younger folks watching, this is the world your parents or grandparents were navigating when they were your age. The anxiety was real, the hope was real, and the changes that started in those 5 years, you're still living inside them. To those of you who were there, what do you remember most from that stretch? Was there a moment, a song, a headline, a thing you saw or heard that made you feel like the corner had been turned? Drop it in the comments. I'd love to know. For me, it was probably America. The hostages were coming home, the country didn't feel so dour, and it made the drive up to college inspirational, at least for 3.5 minutes. And hopefully that inspired you to like and subscribe. They're groovy and far out, you know. Shh. I'm CJ, this is Geezer Gab, and remember, if mohawks and glam rock weren't weird at first and then normal, you might need to spend a little more 80s time. See you on the interwebs. Bye.